Hello, Brian Weeks here again with another MMCD contract consideration. This video clip will cover the topic of how to use instructions to tenderers number 4. This presentation is intended for the person preparing the tender package. I refer to this person as the tender author. Owners and consultants may also find this video helps them better understand our documents. In 1981, the Supreme Court of Canada decided a case called Ron Engineering that set the rules for contract tendering in Canada ever since. In that landmark ruling, the court determined that when a tender is offered, a valid contract comes into force between the owner and every bidder who submits a compliant tender. In their terminology, each of these is a Contract A. Contract B is the eventual construction contract which will be signed with the successful bidder. In this video, I'm only going to talk about the terms of Contract A. Under the MMCD, those terms are formed primarily by the instructions to tenderers. In addition, there will be implied terms such as a requirement to only accept a compliant tender, the duty to treat all bidders fairly, a qualified expectation to accept the lowest bidder, and an expectation to protect the integrity of the tendering system. However, it turns out that all those implied terms can be overridden by explicit terms to the contrary in the tender documents. The courts will rarely overturn explicitly written terms on the basis that bidders are knowledgeable and can make a decision whether or not to bid. So, if an owner wishes to have a preference, this is just fine with the courts on two conditions. First, the owner must be explicitly clear about how tenders will be evaluated, and second, the owner must follow those rules when doing the evaluation. Can't change your mind afterwards. As mentioned, the instructions to tenderers is the primary document containing the terms of Contract A. Under the MMCD, the instructions to tenderers are located in two places. Part 1. The part that has to change with every project is provided in editable form and is called Part 1. The tender author takes this template and modifies it as required for things like the date, time, and location of tender closing, the lists of documents and drawings forming Contract B, and alterations to Part 2. Part 2, the part of the instructions to tenderers that does not normally change from one contract to the next, is located as the first pink pages in Volume 2. It contains, among many others, things like the tender requirements, site inspection, tax considerations, changing of subcontractors, and how optional work will be treated. Now, what happens if an author needs to change something in the fixed Part 2, say a term of Contract A, which is inappropriate for a given project or owner? This is where IT-4 comes in. IT-4 is the last of the clauses in Part 1, the variable portion. As you can see, it is just a placeholder with a note for the author to add text. And it's used for only three purposes. First, to add conditions to Contract A, which the MMCD did not provide. Or second, to alter a condition of Contract A, which the owner wishes to modify. Or third, to remove a condition of Contract A from IT Part 2, which the owner wishes to delete. Let's look at an example of each. Say an owner wishes to add a condition of tendering which requires the submitted package to include a copy of the bidder's corporate safety policy. MMCD does not provide language for this, so the author will simply write the necessary requirement as a subclause of IT-4. As a second example, perhaps the owner has decided that any amendments to a tender sent before closing time must be signed by exactly the same persons who signed the original tender. As this is contrary to IT 12.2, the author would have to write a subclause to IT-4 which modified the IT 12.2 language to meet the owner's new requirement. As a third example, let's say that the owner does not wish to accept any form of cash for the tender security. The only way to accomplish this is to write a subclause under IT-4 saying something like, bidders are advised that IT 5.2.2 is hereby deleted. The owner will only accept a bid bond pursuant to IT 5.2.1 for bid security. Well, so far this seems pretty simple. However, I've seen some problematic subclauses written into IT-4. This is almost always due to confusion about Contract A versus Contract B. Remember, the instructions to tenderers are intended to apply to the tendering and award process, not to the construction contract. Because of this, the instructions to tenderers rank near the bottom of the hierarchy of our documents under GC 2.2.4. Thus, if a condition of Contract B is contrary to an instruction to tenderers, the IT clause will be overruled. Let me give you an example. Say the owner wishes to make the contract administrator responsible for the issuance of substantial performance certificates for subcontractors. To be sure that bidders and their subcontractors know this, the author writes in instructions to tenderers saying, bidders are advised that on this project, the payment certifier for builder's lien purposes for all subcontracts shall be the contract administrator. What happens then is that the GC clause 18.6.6 specifies that the contractor is the payment certifier for subcontractors. Since the GCs override the instructions to tenderers, the owner's intentions are foiled. The correct way to accomplish the owner's objectives is to write a supplemental general condition with the new language. Supplemental GCs override the standard GCs, so the new language will take effect. Then, if the owner is concerned about advising all bidders and subcontractors of this change, the author can write an informative subclause into IT-4. It would say something like, bidders are advised to take particular note of supplemental GC SGC 18.6.6, which changes the payment certifier for subcontractors. To summarize, the instructions to tenderers are the primary document forming Contract A between the owner and all bidders individually. MMCD provides the instructions in two parts. Part 1 is modifiable for each project, and Part 2 is supplied as part of Bound Volume 2. To modify, delete, or add conditions for tendering, the tender author will write the necessary subclauses into IT-4. Owners can write just about anything into Contract A via IT-4, but once tendered, the owner must comply with what was written. Remember, use IT-4 only for changes to Contract A. Changes which are intended to apply during the construction contract need to be made by writing supplementaries to other documents. I hope this has helped clarify this contract consideration. Please check our website for further assistance and to see what other topics are presented in this series. Thanks for watching.